In a quiet museum in England, behind glass and fluorescent light, sits a small clay object most people walk past without stopping. It's about 8 inches tall, 4 sides, covered edge to edge in tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet mud more than 4,000 years ago. At first glance it looks unremarkable, but this object contains a claim so extreme that, if taken seriously for even a moment, it breaks the entire story of human history. It lists the first kings of Earth, not dozens, not hundreds, just 8. And according to the text, the first of those kings ruled for 28,800 years, the next for 36,000 years. One reign after another stretching longer than all of recorded civilization combined. Then, without warning, the tablet draws a line. It says a flood swept over the land. The world ended. And when history resumes on the other side of that line, something is different. Kings still rule, but their reigns are shorter, hundreds of years, then dozens, then finally lengths of time that look disturbingly human. This isn't a myth written as poetry. It's not a legend full of monsters or gods battling in the sky. It's a bureaucratic list. Names, numbers, cities, dynasties, copied again and again by generations of scribes who preserved every impossible number with obsessive precision. And beneath the ruins of the cities those scribes lived in, archaeologists later found something else the text insists should be there. A thick layer of flood sediment separating an older world from a newer one, a before and an after. Here's where it becomes unsettling. This exact pattern, extremely long lifespans before a cataclysm, followed by a steady decline afterward, appears again and again across cultures that never met. In the Bible, in ancient India's Yuga cycles, in Greek and Mesoamerican traditions, different names, different gods, same structure, long ages, a collapse, a diminished world. As if humanity, everywhere on Earth, is remembering the same event, but in fragments. So the question isn't whether these ancient kings were literally immortal. The question is why civilizations separated by oceans all preserved the same strange memory. Why the numbers shrink in the same direction. Why the flood always sits at the centre. And why modern history insists that everything before 10,000 years ago was simple, when the artifacts, the myths, and even the soil itself refuse to agree. Tonight, we're not asking whether the story is true in the way we usually define truth. We're asking something more dangerous. What if this tablet isn't mythology at all? What if it's a compressed record of civilizations that rose, collapsed, and were almost completely erased, long before the one we live in now? And if that's the case, what layer of history are we standing on? Let's stay with the raw numbers because they hit like a cold slap. 8 rulers before the deluge and their reigns read like geological time. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. Add them up and you arrive at spans that swallow entire civilizations. These aren't vague, long ago claims. They are specific durations presented as administrative data. Names are attached, cities are listed, and the figures dwarf anything human history can absorb. The pyramids, vast as they are, fall inside a tiny slice of these timelines, like a recent renovation in an old building whose foundation vanishes into deep time. The strangeness sharpens when you look closer. Those impossible reigns resolve into clean arithmetic, multiples of 3,600, stack with a discipline that feels more like a ledger than a legend. The pattern repeats with an almost mechanical neatness, across copies made centuries apart. If a scribe were inflating a story, you'd expect a drift in the numbers, a flourish here or a correction there. Instead, the figures lock together, each slotting into a grid defined by a base they used every day. It looks like a system. It behaves like a code. And through all the retellings, the structure holds. That brings us to the people who carried these figures forward. Scribes didn't treat this list like a tale to be updated with each generation's taste. They kept the figures intact even when they clashed with lived experience. To them, biologically impossible wasn't a reason to alter the text, it was a reason to preserve it. This suggests a purpose beyond entertainment or royal propaganda. They wrote and copied with the care of stewards, not authors, as if their job was to transmit something exact, not to make it believable. Then there's the knife edge that cuts the text in two. Before the flood, rules of time act one way. After the flood, they act another. This isn't a soft transition or a poetic metaphor that blurs at the edges. The list marks a boundary and the math on either side plays by different rules. Time, as expressed through reigns, seems to contract. The break functions like a calibration mark on a measuring stick. Whatever is being measured changes unit at that line. When you trace the figures after that boundary, the decline lands with a steady rhythm. What towers at tens of thousands suddenly halves, then halves again, lowering in steps that remain divisible by the same base. You see values like 18,600, then 10,800, then 3,600, each stage forming part of a planned descent, as if someone adjusted a dial down through fixed settings rather than letting it spin loosely. That smooth curve doesn't read like the noise of many storytellers, it reads like a procedure. As the durations compress towards scales we recognise, the list starts to speak a language historians can verify. City names align with mounds you can stand on. Inscriptions match kings whose monuments and administrative records show up in dig reports. At first, the text behaves like a relic from an alien chronology. Then it steps with increasing confidence into the same ground we excavate. That creates a jarring double vision. The top of the list feels unreachable, the bottom ties cleanly to the archaeological world. And this is where the credibility paradox bites. The same tablet that asserts 1,000-century reigns also maps onto known timelines with increasing clarity as it approaches the historical horizon. Dismiss the early part and you still face the late part behaving with detail and accuracy that reflect real polities, real conflicts and real urban centres. A document that grows more correct over time looks like a text anchored in a method, not a fantasy padded with numbers for drama. The precision seems baked in from the start. If this were a typical myth cycle, you'd expect the post-flood area to drift toward ordinary stories. Some kings long, some short, memorable episodes taking priority over numeric consistency. But what we see is structure asserting itself. The figures do not bounce randomly around a mean. They trace a path. That path tracks with internal mathematics and with the progressive appearance of historical markers. At that point, coincidence stops being a satisfying answer. The list behaves as if it encodes something measurable, so the centre of gravity shifts. The practical question isn't were these people immortal, it becomes what happened that could make recorded time behave as if it was stretching and then contracting. The flood stops functioning as a morality play and starts acting like a reset button. The numbers don't moralise, they recalculate. The implication is not thunderbolt justice, it's system failure and reboot, with cycle lengths shortening as if stress accumulates between resets. One objection tries to smooth the edges by changing units after the fact, turning years into months or seasons so the first entries shrink to plausible lengths. Another tries to read the numbers as pure symbolism, a way to place early rulers close to the divine and later rulers closer to us. But those approaches fight the data's behaviour. If the figures were only symbols, you would not expect their fine-grained consistency across copies, or the matching tempo of decline. If the units were misunderstood, you'd expect confusion to leak all over the list, not a clean switch aligned with a narrative break that also appears in the ground as flood layers. Archaeology adds another weight to the scale. In several of the earlier cities, the list references excavators found thick, clean deposits laid down by water beneath later sacred buildings. Those layers act like the text's line in clay and silt. Above them, reorganised settlement, new building programs, the rise of institutions we can trace. Below them, an older phase cut short. The text and the strata talk to each other in a way stories don't have to. They agree that something ended and a new order began. The longer you stare, the more the pattern refuses to relax into legend. It keeps snapping back to metrics, to systems, to rules. You're looking at a document that seems to compress very long orders of organisation into ruler names, then marks a break, then walks back toward daily human time step by mathematical step until the past and the trowel shake hands. You can ignore the top because it looks impossible, but the bottom keeps dragging you back with its stubborn fit to reality, which leads to a confronting thought. If one culture could frame a collapse and recovery cycle in exact numbers and make that framework survive millennia of copying, is it the only one that tried? If a floodline cleaves their timeline, do we see the same cleaver elsewhere? Not in the same words or theology, but in the same structure. If the pattern is more than accidental, it should leave rhyme in records far from Mesopotamia. And if the rhyme exists, we have to ask whether the memory it preserves is local lore, or a global event that left the same echo in communities that never spoke to each other. Here's the jolt that resets the frame. That strange Sumerian curve isn't an outlier. Versions of the same shape recur across the map, as if different languages tried to say one rhythm, long ages up front, a break, then a clean, steady decline, not once, not twice. Everywhere people kept records long enough to remember. Start with India's timekeeping. The Yuga system lays out 4 ages that shrink in both virtue and lifespan. In the first, human life stretches to 100,000 years. In the final, it contracts to about a century. The durations of those ages follow fixed proportions, an internal math that locks the sequence into a ratio rather than a legend. It is not a loose saga about heroes. It is a calendar of loss that treats decline as measurable. The point isn't how many zeros sit on the numbers, it's that the pattern is explicit and structured. The fall mapped as a schedule rather than a fable. Move across to the Levant and the early Hebrew records. Before the flood, lifespans run to 9 centuries. After the waters recede, the line steps down through the generations until the numbers match what we call normal. The shift does not wobble. It contracts over time in a controlled slope, generation by generation, as if the era itself shortened the runway on which a life could travel. No poetry explains it away. It's a set of genealogies with ages attached that tighten after a single dividing event. Then Greece. The ages of man descend from gold to silver to bronze to the age of heroes, and finally to iron. Each transition removes a layer of ease and strength. People become less capable, less sturdy, and more exposed to toil and conflict. It's not only years that change, it's the quality of being human. The arc bends down through metals and myths, but points to the same conclusion. The present is thinner than the past. Mesoamerica preserves its own cycle. The Aztec suns tell of world ages, each ending in destruction and followed by a rebuild. Humanity survives, but smaller and more fragile each time. The cosmos resets, and the next human world starts with less. The details differ. The element that ends each age, the deities involved, but the structure matches the Sumerian shape with eerie fidelity. Long ago lasts longer, then the sky falls, then a shorter restart. At this point, a single theme repeating would be a curiosity, but a shared template that includes long initial spans, a catastrophic break, and a systematic decline begins to stress probability. These cultures did not share textbooks. Oceans separated them. Their gods and social orders diverged. Yet the skeleton of their deep time stories aligns down to the function of the break. A flood, a ruin, a fall that redraws the map of possibility. The question shifts from why do people write flood stories to why do widely separated traditions preserve the same countdown? This is where the great shrinking comes into focus. The pattern goes beyond calendar math. In these systems, people don't only live shorter lives, they also do less with those lives. Strength, wisdom, and what many traditions call closeness to the divine, all pull back. Knowledge becomes harder to keep. Skills that were obvious to ancestors feel out of reach to descendants. The world doesn't end once, it contracts. Each restart begins with thinner thread. A quick counter might point to convergent evolution in storytelling. Floods happen, people want golden pasts. Shared psychology can explain similar plots. That carries weight for motifs. The ship, the survivor, the warning. It struggles with the math. The Yuga durations fall into fixed ratios. The Sumerian reigns lock into multiples of a base unit. The biblical post-flood ages step down in a curve rather than random scatter. Myth-tellers could copy themes. They rarely copy numerical structures, especially when divided by oceans and thousands of years. When different traditions encode decline with numbers that act like schedules, you have to ask what they were counting. If independent invention and casual borrowing look thin, the next candidate is a shared trigger. For a pattern to appear on every inhabited continent, the cause would need to be planetary, not a local drought, not a single river flood. A change in operating conditions large enough that survivors everywhere felt a before and an after. The form that experience takes in memory becomes story. The skeleton beneath, the sequence of long age, fracture, shortened age, stays the same because the shape of the change was the same. Once you make that move, the path points underground. If cultures retain a common blueprint of collapse and contraction, we should see scars that match that size. Rock layers. Sediments where the old world stops and a different one starts. If a global or near-global disruption forced people into new patterns, the record would live not only in epics and lists, but also in mud, sand, and drowned riverbeds. That's the terrain where story and stone can be tested side by side. The alignment across cultures isn't tidy in its props or characters, and it doesn't need to be. A calendar in India, genealogies in the Levant, metals and morals in Greece, rotating suns in Mesoamerica, each uses its own language to point at the same structure. Long stability, a break that feels like ending, shorter, weaker rounds after. In every case, authority figures shrink along with the human world around them, whether those figures are kings, patriarchs, or entire ages given names. The math hides in plain sight not to impress, but to anchor memory in something harder to blur. What that suggests is uncomfortable. If generations experienced repeated contractions, they would build warning systems into culture to outlast the next wave. They would code the lesson into stories children had to hear, and numbers scribes had to copy exactly. They would repeat the shape often enough that even when names were lost and gods were swapped, the core would persist. That is what we see. And it lands us in a place where we have to test the earth for memory, the way we test clay tablets. So the trail runs from museum glass to bedrock. If identical patterns of long ages, breaks and decline, surface in places that never traded maps, then we're not dealing with a single region's imagination. We're hearing the echo of something that bent the entire stage. The next step is to drop below the myths and look for the ground truth they might be pointing to. The layers that show a world that changed fast, and the coastlines that moved like a tide with no return key. 12,000 years ago, the map of Earth bore little resemblance to the one on classroom walls. Ice sheets rose 2 miles high across North America and Northern Europe, pressing continents down under their mass and locking away so much water that global sea level sat roughly 400 feet lower. Shorelines stretched far beyond today's coasts. Rivers cut across plains that are now continental shelves. Then the melt began. Not as a slow drip, but as surges. In the span of human lifetimes, seas stepped forward in hard jolts. A family could mark the loss of a fishing ground, a village, and then an ancestral burial site to a horizon that would not stop moving. Those surges had names in modern research, meltwater pulses, and their effect would have felt personal. A rise of 15 to 20 feet across a single generation turns safe ground into tidal flats, and wipes out every settlement built at the water's edge. Communities that had organised around estuaries and lagoons were forced inland, again and again. Fields, shell middens, docks, huts and footpaths disappeared under a sheet of advancing salt water. With each inland retreat, the record of their lives sank behind them. A coastline is generous to people. It offers protein, transport, and trade. It does not forgive maps that shift faster than a culture can move. Beneath today's oceans lies a drowned landscape. On the wide shelves around continents, where the sea is now a few hundred feet deep, ancient river valleys still run. Submerged hills rise like islands that never broke the surface in our era. During the Ice Age, these areas would have hosted forests, grasslands, and long, shallow bays rich with fish. That is where people gathered, built, and exchanged. Today, those places sit beneath 300 feet of water. We have sonar maps and scattered cores. We do not have harbours to excavate with street plans and market stalls, because accessing them requires marine campaigns that are costly, technical, and rare. This creates a blunt archaeological consequence. If the earliest complex societies favoured coasts for food and movement, then the fastest growing and most networked settlements were the first to drown. The inland record we study, caves, rock shelters and highland sites, may be the emergency archives of people forced uphill. The primary record, the towns and seasonal sites where experimentation with storage, ritual and proto-trade could scale, now lies underwater. Absence in the dirt on land becomes a poor measure of what once existed at sea level that no longer exists at all. As the melt advanced, the climate swerved. The planet had been warming, then the Younger Dryas hit. Within what would have felt like a decade, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged back toward glacial conditions. Ecosystems that had shifted to warmer patterns snapped back. Large animals that anchored human hunting economies vanished across regions. Tool traditions broke in the record. What had been predictable seasons fractured into extremes, with knock-on effects on plants, prey, and people. The shock lives inside that sudden reversal, not as a graph line, but as missed migrations, barren shores, and winters that arrived early and left late. When events move that fast, survivors compress them into the language they can carry. A shoreline that eats your village is a flood. A climate swing that kills the animals your grandparents depended on is a world-ending storm. A sky choked with smoke from continent-scale fires becomes an age of darkness. Myths do not need to invent disasters when memory already holds them. Flood narratives that speak of a world erased and rebuilt can track the real sensation of standing on a coast that fails to hold its shape, and of walking inland to start over. If catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age drove cycles of retreat and reset, then entire chapters of human organisation could lie underwater. Trade routes that once hugged a coast now trace a sonar line. Regional hubs that acted as collection points for shell, stone and idea exchange sit beyond safe diving depth. Knowledge encoded in tools, in weirs and fish traps, in the routes of canoes and paths along bluff edges, was not only abandoned, it was buried beneath salt water and sediment, left invisible to anyone who studies maps that end at the shore. This leaves us with a blind spot. Archaeology excels where dry ground preserves. The oldest clay, bone and pigment we know best come from caves and deserts, from places that stayed above floodlines and offered shelter from scouring winds. But early people were practical. They tracked food and movement. Coastlines offered both. That suggests the heartlands of early complexity are the least accessible today. We weigh the past using the debris that survived on ridgelines and uplands and treat it as the main story. It might be the appendix to a book kept on the continental shelf. The surviving record still throws hard questions at simple timelines. Göbekli Tepe rises on a hill in southeastern Turkey, with carved stone pillars and organised enclosures dated to the 10th millennium BCE. The labour, planning and social coordination involved point-to-capacities that do not fit cleanly inside the standard model that expects agriculture to precede monuments. Here, monumental expression appears while domestication is still forming. It feels like a remnant of a rulebook that was written elsewhere, then carried inland during instability and reassembled on high ground. Elsewhere, submerged features off modern coasts spark debate. Terraces and rectilinear structures off islands, sonar returns from now drowned estuaries, and tool scatters sealed under marine sediment all hint at a shoreline life that is documented only where currents and visibility allow. We argue rightly over which features are human-made and which are natural. The larger point holds either way. The prime real estate of prehistory now sits beneath water, and our sample of early complexity is biased by what happened to be uphill when the sea rose. If we take that bias seriously, then myths and sediments become data. Black layers at certain late Pleistocene sites, chemical markers of intense burning, and sudden faunal shifts speak to environmental stress. Oral histories of floods and lost lands, repeated on islands and coasts worldwide, track the same theme. The match to global sea level curves is not exact. Story and shoreline live on different clocks. But the parallels press us to treat narrative as a storage device that can survive when libraries cannot. Under this view, the end of the Ice Age is not a clean transition from wild to civilized. It is a staggered process of gain and loss, with people carrying techniques and beliefs inland, trying them out in new ecologies, and rebuilding social structures at smaller scales. As waters stabilised, some of those inland experiments grew into settled farming and towns. Others failed. What we read as a first rise might be a resumption after the shelf world drowned. That shifts how we interpret earliest. The oldest standing monuments we can visit today may mark not the beginning of organisation, but the first successful restarts after ocean rise. Technologies and cosmologies could have passed through bottlenecks, stripped down to essentials and then rebuilt, which would explain why certain engineering, astronomical awareness, and ritual forms appear mature as soon as our surviving record picks them up. The shelf swallowed their prototypes. If environmental shocks can erase coastlines and compress experience into myth, then the next move is straightforward. We go to what remains above water and ask what it preserves that feels out of place. We test whether anomalous sites are outliers or footholds. We look for alignments, material choices, and construction habits that signal carried memory rather than spontaneous invention. And we treat the gap at the shoreline not as silence, but as a missing archive thick enough to hold cities. The question stops being whether a single flood matches a single story. It becomes whether the planet's own record of violent change matches the structure those stories share. Sea level graphs, deglacial pulses, and sudden climate reversals say the world offered multiple chances for a culture to drown and start over. The surviving sites on heights and inland plains, the ones we can still walk, hold the residue of those restarts. Now we go there and read them for what they should not be able to do. Göbekli Tepe sits on a ridge in southeastern Turkey, and it behaves like a quiet demolition charge under our assumptions. The site dates to around 9,500 BCE, which means massive stone pillars went up before fields of wheat surrounded permanent villages. The pillars stand taller than people, carved with foxes, snakes, boars and birds, and arranged in circular enclosures with careful geometry. Workers moved stone blocks weighing tons without metal tools, wheeled carts, or draft animals. The conventional story says agriculture stabilizes food production, population rises, then specialization enables monuments. Here, the order reverses. The monument comes first, and the society capable of organizing it appears ahead of our schedule. The part that refuses to fade into a tourist snapshot is the burial. Around 8,000 BCE, the builders hauled in thousands of tons of soil and backfill and entombed the pillars. Not abandonment, not collapse, deliberate concealment. They did not scatter or topple the stones. They packed them in, as if the structure needed to be hidden from weather, from looters, or from time itself. That choice forces a question we rarely ask of prehistoric sites. Who thought this place needed protection, and what did they think the future would lose without it? The effort was not trivial. Moving that much fill requires sustained labour, planning, and intent. It reads less like a culture drifting away, and more like one preserving something it could no longer keep in the open. Pull back to the coastlines, now submerged. Off Yonaguni Island in Japan, divers find stepped terraces and right-angled features that some researchers argue show tool marks and intentional shaping, while many geologists attribute them to natural fracturing and erosion. In the Gulf of Khambat near India, sonar surveys report regular structures and artifacts pulled from a drowned riverbed, though the interpretations remain contested. In Indonesia, Gunung Padang shows massive constructions layered beneath a hill, with arguments over how old its earliest phases might be. Each site sparks debate, and the debates matter, but the pattern is the point. Potential complexity sits where sea levels rose hundreds of feet after the last ice age, right where early people would have clustered for water, food, and trade. The Amazon adds another layer and it erases a bias. LiDAR flights over rainforest canopy reveal geometric earthworks, road grids, causeways, and settlement clusters linked across broad regions. No pyramids pierce the skyline. Stone does not shout, yet the footprint sprawls. This forces a correction. Civilization does not always express itself in granite and limestone. It can be vast and biodegradable. Timber posts, earthen platforms, woven fibre, clay plaster, leaving only low mounds and soil signatures once the forest returns. That reframing matters when we ask what the past could have built and lost, without leaving the kind of ruins we're trained to recognise. Now consider the archaeological thinness problem. Since the last ice age ended, global sea levels have risen over 400 feet, drowning continental shelves where rivers met the sea. Those shelves offered flat land, fresh water, fishing and trade routes, prime real estate for early complex societies. Whatever stood there now lies under hundreds of feet of water, silted over, hard to detect and harder to excavate. Inland, rivers shift course, and floodplains bury settlements beneath meters of sediment. If you want to erase a chapter of history, raise the ocean and move the rivers. We read the past from what remains on high ground and in caves. That is like reconstructing a library from the books that happened to be in the basement when the fire started. The anomalies keep clustering around a theme, sophisticated knowledge showing up too early. Alignments to solstices and star paths appear in structures long before our models say they should. Ratios and constants show up in measurements where our timelines expect cruder approximations. Engineering solutions, drainage, foundation stabilization, interlocking joinery emerge, go quiet, then reappear centuries later as if rediscovered rather than invented fresh. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck, works as a geared computer modelling celestial cycles in the 1st century BCE, then disappears from the record until medieval clockwork. When knowledge surfaces at high precision surrounded by lower-tech contexts, it suggests continuity through memory, copying or teaching lines we do not see, rather than clean ladders of invention. Mainstream frameworks don't ignore these cases, but they apply brakes. They point out issues of dating, context, and sample size. They note that geology can mimic architecture underwater, that trade goods can move technology without independent invention, and that one remarkable artifact can mislead when treated as a trend. Those cautions are necessary. At the same time, there is tension when individual anomalies begin to cluster, when multiple lines, underwater hints, early monuments, lost urban ecologies, press the timeline in the same direction. Institutions rely on conservative inference. They shift only when evidence accumulates beyond a given threshold. Until then, the official story lags behind the frontier where new data lands. Return to Göbekli Tepe and the burial decision. If people in the early Holocene encase knowledge in stone and then in soil, that looks like a preservation strategy. In other contexts, we see similar impulses. knowledge packed into durable mediums, protected from weather, predators, and human conflict. The Amazon's earthworks encoded geometry and landscape engineering that survived under canopy. The argument about Yonaguni hinges on whether steps were carved or fractured, but either way we find that our historical visibility collapses underwater. Combine these facts and a picture forms, not a single global civilization, but pockets of organisation, skill, and memory adapting to changing coasts and climates, preserving what they can, losing what they must. The underwater conversation deserves specifics. Continental shelves once hosted rivers that now terminate out at sea. Those drowned river valleys create natural harbours for silt, burying any human constructions beneath layers that require advanced sub-bottom imaging to find. Even if we detect a structure, dating it becomes a trial. Wood rots, fibres decay, and toolkits vanish. A wall without context is a rock. This means the absence of excavated coastal cities before 10,000 years ago tells us little about whether they existed, because the sampling method, land archaeology, cannot reach them. When the medium fails, the message stays hidden. Inland, deserts and mountains preserve better, which is why so much of our earliest hard evidence sits in arid zones. That preserves a skew. We mistake what survives for what was common. The Amazon LiDAR surveys correct for that by seeing through vegetation rather than waiting for stone to endure. They show that planned landscapes can disappear without catastrophe, swallowed by growth. Scale can live in dirt and die in dirt, leaving only a faint plan view for a laser to reveal thousands of years later. The too early problem also includes math. Monument axes mark solstices, angles recur, circles, ellipses and cardinal alignments anchor constructions separated by long distances and different materials. These are not magic tricks. They require careful observation, shared rules, and intergenerational teaching. If a collapse interrupts that chain, the knowledge does not vanish. It compresses into ritual layouts and rules of thumb. Later, someone expands it back into explicit calculations. This expansion and compression pattern fits a world of cycles better than a straight climb. Resistance to expanding timelines often comes from the burden of proof. Extraordinary age claims need extraordinary context. Fair enough. But cycles leave gaps. Floodplains cover, seas rise, jungles digest. If we wait for the perfect site that survives all that, we may be asking the wrong question. The better test is coherence across domains. Do early monuments, submerged hints, biodegradable cities, and out-of-place precision all pull the timeline taut in the same direction? At Göbekli Tepe, organisation precedes agriculture. Offshore, potential sites sit where prime land drowned. Under canopy, cities vanish without stone. In shipwrecks, complex gears appear, then leave no workshop trail. That is not proof of a lost supercivilization. It is a map of missing chapters. So how do we read a clay prism listing impossible rains in the light of this landscape? We treat it the way we treat Göbekli Tepe's fill or an Amazon geoglyph, an object built to carry memory across inhospitable time. If ancient people preserved structures by burying them and encoded landscapes in earthworks that vanish gently, a text that shocks with numbers may be doing the same job by different means. The method changes. Stone, soil, laser-mapped ditches, bronze gears, or a tablet full of impossible years, but the intent rhymes. Protect what matters from erasure long enough for someone someday to rebuild the context around it. So here's the relief valve scholars reach for when the numbers start to feel impossible. Base 60. The scribes of southern Mesopotamia lived in a world built on sexagesimal math. 60s stacked on 60s. In that system, 3,600 is a natural milestone, 60 squared, a neat container called a shah. Now look back at those towering reigns and watch them click into place as multiples of 3,600. A number that looks absurd in solar years starts to behave, when you treat it as a mathematical sentence, not a biological claim. It's tidy, it's internally consistent. And because the list keeps its arithmetic clean across copies and cities, this theory gives us a way to breathe. Maybe the numbers never aimed at lived years at all. Maybe they are elegant expressions inside a system we only half remember. Another pressure release shows up when you swap the unit. If the list's years were lunar months, you divide by 12. Suddenly 28,800 shrinks to 2,400. Still long, but a dynasty could span that. A lineage treated as one throne could wear that number without supernatural lifespans. Push the same conversion across other entries, and the landscape flattens from mountain peaks to high plateaus. Daunting, but walkable. Some extend the idea further and test quarters of the year, seasons, so a year equals 3 months, and the reduction becomes even more forgiving. You can picture how a later scribe, seeing an inherited mark for time, might read it as solar years by default and lock in a misunderstanding that snowballed through generations. Then there's the sky. People argue the list is an ephemeris in disguise, a register of cosmic cycles pinned to names for memory's sake. Precession lurks in the background at roughly 25,920 years for a full wobble of Earth's axis. Subsections of that great circle map to recognisable packets. If the reigns are slices of a celestial clock, the list links earthly rule to the turning heavens. Kingship becomes timing, not longevity. In that frame, the floodline signals a change of configuration, the way a clock's chime marks the hour. The idea has a poetic logic. Temple economies ran on calendars and omens. Encoding cycles into narrative would fuse authority to the sky's order and help keep time across generations without precision instruments. A softer reading leans to symbolism. Early rulers stand closer to the divine, so their measures swell to sacred scales. As history moves forward and the gods recede, numbers collapse toward human reach. The figures then become theology by arithmetic, a way to say that the first kings ruled at the boundary between mortal and cosmic law. The long counts do not claim flesh lived that long, they mark proximity. Over time, divinity thins, and so do the spans. It tracks with how many cultures tell their own beginnings, a golden clarity at the start, then a slow dulling. Each of these frameworks patches a piece, but seams show. If the values were only sacred placeholders, why copy them with such mechanical fidelity across centuries? Mythic inflation usually drifts, yet the list repeats exact totals like a ledger. If a scribe misread units, the error should smear across the text. Some entries bloated, others trimmed, transitions messy. Instead, there's a clean fracture at the flood and a post-flood glide that tightens in stepwise fashion, not chaos. If it's astronomy alone, why does the numerical descent after the flood curve towards spans that line up with later checkable reigns? A star clock need not converge on human dynasties unless the text also tracks a grounded chronology. The timing creates a sharper problem. The handoff from impossible to plausible happens exactly where archaeology starts finding anchors. Names on bricks, cities in the dirt, synchronisms with neighbouring records. If misunderstanding drove the early part, we would expect scatter lingering past the floodline. Instead, we get a structure that behaves like intention. Encrypted before, documentary after. The document knows where the clay confirms. That doesn't sit well with an accidental unit swap, and the pattern won't stay in Mesopotamia. Arguments tied to sexagesimal elegance or local sky law stumble when the same decline structure turns up in distant traditions that use different maths, calendars, and theologies. If the explanation is purely Sumerian numeracy, it cannot carry the near-identical curve housed in texts from cultures with other counting habits. If it's only a constellation of sacred numbers, the recurring smooth decline after a break becomes hard to dismiss as mere coincidence stacked across continents. Which pushes us back into the uncomfortable space the list forces open. The numbers act like vessels. They move through time intact, protected in schools of scribes who refuse to normalize them even when human biology disagrees. The flood sits like a switch. Before it, measure expands to scales that no person can wear. After it, the system constricts on a path that looks designed to land on historical ground. Whether we speak in shars, moons, or stars, none of the relief valves explain why the curve itself holds. So maybe the question is wrong. The impulse to fix the units, or to rewrote years into heavens, keeps us arguing about whether individuals could live that long, or whether priests hid calendar math in royal myths. But what if the entries never aim to be either lifespans or codes about the sky? What if the names that look like men are memory devices for something larger than a throne? An age can wear a name. A dynasty can absorb dozens of rulers and get told as one. A civilizational phase, stable institutions, consistent ritual, shared engineering habits, can last an astonishing stretch if measured by continuity rather than by a single heartbeat. Seen that way, the pre-flood reigns become long periods of order under a single emblem, counted in shars because that's how you keep track of vast spans cleanly. The flood then reads as a structural break, not a storm, an end of one regime of living, an overhaul of environment and organisation, after which the recovery phases compress. Each later reign is shorter, not because people suddenly die earlier, but because coherence itself degrades faster. The system's ability to hold together contracts with each cycle, and the numbers record that contraction. This reframing doesn't require redefining years or hauling everything into the sky. It uses the precision the scribes guarded and treats it as a signal. It keeps the flood's role as a hinge without turning it into a parable about punishment. And it matches the way the list resolves as it approaches the time we can audit. The symbolic epochs give way to rulers we can place, because the cycles have shortened to human scales that our evidence can catch. The relief theories soften the shock of the early columns, but the names start to make sense when the kings stop being people. The next step is to test whether that shift can hold across the broader record and whether other traditions point to cycles wearing crowns instead of men. What if the problem isn't the numbers at all, but our assumption that those names tag individual people? If we stop treating a Lulim and the others as human biographies and start seeing them as labels for whole phases of history, the impossible lengths stop fighting us. They begin to act like the durations of eras, compressed epochs disguised as rulers, written in a format that a scribe, a temple, and a student could all pass on without losing the structure. That shift lands cleanly in an ancient worldview. Pre-modern cultures often saw time as a wheel rather than a line. A king didn't just manage taxes or wars, he upheld cosmic order. His reign stood for a condition of the world, what the sky did, how rivers behaved, how cities flourished or failed. In that frame, a reign reads less like a lifespan and more like a stable phase, a set of patterns that held until they didn't. A scribe recording that kind of time would naturally choose a person-shaped container, because people are memorable, and memory was the point. We still do this without thinking. We say Victorian to compress industrial expansion, social codes, empire, and science into one monarch's name. We call a burst of culture Elizabethan and carry theatre, maritime power, and a religious settlement inside that label. Those eras don't vanish when the monarch dies, but the name makes a messy stretch of time feel legible. Ancient record keepers had even stronger reason to personify. Writing was scarce, pedagogy oral, archives vulnerable, archetypes travel farther than ledgers. Now run that lens over the first entry, Alulim, 28,800 years. As a human claim, nonsense. As an epoch it reads like a long, steady arrangement of life, the first stable build-out of organised society. Plenty of food, a climate window that holds, a social code that reduces conflict, a network of ritual and knowledge that persists. In other words, a long first coherence before a rupture. Slot the next ruler as the next kind of order. The lengths stop begging for biological contortions and start mapping endurance. how long each civilizational configuration stayed viable. Suddenly the text begins to cooperate. The raw multiples become a timing grid. The scribe's precision stops feeling like superstition and starts sounding like calibration. The flood, placed as a sharp boundary, flips from moral tale to reset marker, and the creep from impossible durations down into spans we can verify with bricks, graves and trade records matches what we see when we step from myth into written chronicles. The same document that looks outrageous in the first rows becomes careful bookkeeping later, which makes much more sense if the whole thing was always about cycles. Notice how the decline reads differently under this model. After the boundary, each reign shortens, not because human biology suddenly collapses, but because recovery windows shrink. Each rebuild phase pulls from a smaller reserve of land, resources and inherited knowledge. Networks take shape, crack under new stresses, and reform faster, but for less time. That smooth curve of contraction on the tablet becomes a timeline of cultural stamina wearing down, not a list of humans losing years from their birthdays. This is where the ground joins the theory. Monuments at sites like Göbekli Tepe show organisational reach that runs for centuries inside a single building tradition, at dates that rattle linear models of progress. Add submerged coastal features that hint at settlement where we no longer look, and the idea of long coherent phases of culture doesn't sound like nostalgia, it sounds practical. People built stable systems when conditions allowed it. When conditions broke, the systems ended. If a scribe knew his heritage by cycles, he would mark each sustained arrangement with a king, keep the math tidy, and treat the boundary as sacred because that was when the rules changed. This reframing also lowers the noise around those exact numbers. The sexagesimal multiples stop needing rescue theories. They become the expected tool for segmenting large durations into memorable packets. If you want your students to remember that 3 great orders held before the deluge, and that each lasted a precise share of the grand count, you encode them in clean, repeatable quantities. Future copyists don't adjust the ledger because the point isn't life expectancy. It's the cadence of stability. It also explains the scribal behaviour. Generation after generation copied figures they knew couldn't be literal bodies aging in palaces, yet they refused to sand them down. That looks like respect for a system. The numbers mattered because they held the scaffold of time. Change the figures and you break the pattern. Leave them and the pattern survives the next famine, dynastic shift or invasion. And this view makes the list's most awkward feature, the sudden feasibility of later entries, make sense. As the record approaches the range that coincides with independent inscriptions and excavated cities, the kings turn into people we can verify. Not because the text finally learns how to count, but because the cycle model converges with ordinary chronology at human scale. Early on, one name can stand for 1,000 years of social continuity. Later, when states rise and fall on shorter intervals, the labels match individuals. Look again at the descending spans after the flood under this light. The curve becomes a series of shorter, more brittle phases. Each cycle inherits fragments from the last, but the carrying capacity, ecological, informational, political, erodes. The tablet reads like a chart of patience thinning across resets. That's not a claim about shrinking bones, it's a claim about shrinking buffers. Once you read the king list as a cycle ledger, it clicks into place with global traditions that also frame history by repeating ages. You don't need perfect one-to-one mapping to notice the shared grammar. Long coherence, rupture, diminished return. In each case, a narrative device, kings, yugas, ages, compresses a macro pattern into forms you can chant, teach, and rebuild from. And then a quieter consequence arrives. If the list encodes cycles, and if each cycle tightens, where are we in that sequence? Our glass, fibre and satellites look nothing like clay, reed and canal, but the shape is familiar. Rapid growth, reach, strain, correction. This reading doesn't predict an end date. It does ask how much endurance our current arrangement actually has, and how much of it depends on memories that can travel without power or permission, which leads down a practical path. If ancient record keepers wrapped whole eras in a single archetypal name to keep the cadence legible across collapse, what are we wrapping? What packets are we making that a student, a farmer, or a refugee could carry through a disruption and use to start again? Because if the tablet's names are cycles, and the flood line is a reset, then the most important thing on that clay might not be who ruled. It might be how long coherence can last and how cleanly it can restart when the river rises. The same outline keeps showing up wherever you look. In one tradition, time starts large and shrinks with each turn. In another, lives stretch for centuries, then fold down to a single lifetime. In a third, humanity begins godlike and ends ordinary. You can argue sources and dates all day, but the structure stays consistent. Vast beginnings, a break, and then smaller, thinner ages that follow. The Hindu Yuga system lays out 4 ages in ratios that grow shorter as virtue and lifespan contract. The earliest age spans cosmic duration. By the last, years and capacity narrow to what we now call normal. In the Hebrew Bible's genealogies, lifespans before the flood reach into the 900s. After the deluge, each generation drops, then drops again until the numbers line up with recorded history. In Greek thought, humanity descends through metals, from a golden age of ease to an iron age of strain, with each step down marking a loss in strength and time. Different myths, different calendars, but the same curve. What makes this hard to wave away is the way that curve behaves. These aren't random tall tales. The declines track in sequences, not chaos. The long eras don't just lop off years. They halve, quarter, and settle into clean intervals. The effect isn't poetic flourish. It reads like a model someone wanted to preserve. Lengths compress, capacities fall, and the world's baseline resets to a smaller scale. To get the same architecture of decline in multiple places without contact, you need either a level of coincidence that strains credulity, or a shared cause strong enough to leave a template in memory. That template looks suspiciously like a record of contraction, as if something about being human, how long we live, how much we can organise, how far a knowledge system can reach, got squeezed. And it's not just about years on a page. When ages shrink, more than lifespans go with them. Networks unwind, writing disappears from regions that once kept ledgers. Trade routes that used to move metals and ideas across seas go silent. Skills splinter into local improvisations. Archaeology reads that shrink as layers of broken supply chains and smaller buildings. Tools shift from complex to simple, then inch back up over centuries. In one collapse, the problem is tin, no networks, no bronze. In another, it's lost scripts, no scribes, no administration. The time it takes to climb back matches the new, shorter rhythms encoded in those old age systems. Long falls, slow rebuilds, and lower ceilings the next time around. We can follow one of these contractions around 1200 BCE. Across the Near East and Mediterranean, cities that had traded letters and goods for generations fell out of touch, then fell altogether. Drought, stressed harvests, hunger pushed people across borders, conflicts spiked, and palaces burned. Urban centres emptied. The system that had made high craft, long-distance trade, and specialised labour possible fractured. For a few hundred years, fewer places could feel the old complexity. The scale writ large got smaller. Not entirely, not everywhere, but enough that historians still mark the gap. A different region tells a similar story 1,000 years later. In the lowlands of the Yucatan, extended drought coincided with the thinning of cities that had once timed calendars to the day and raised monuments by the acre. Populations shifted. Political centres lost reach. Writing and art narrowed to local forms. People didn't vanish. The level of organisation did. Village life carried on where courts and causeways had stood. Over in Europe, the Western empires break up, along with climate swings and disease, led to centuries where roads, coinage, and literacy retreated outside a few resilient channels. Complexity compressed, and it took generations to stitch wide area systems back together. The pattern keeps circling, building up, breaking, and then building again from fewer parts. You see it in toolkits and diets, in house sizes and burial goods, in the spread and retraction of language families. It lands with the same feel those mythic sequences deliver. Here is the big arc, here is the fracture, here is the shorter reassembly. You don't have to force the match. The data reads like the story. Now the uncomfortable part. If we can map several cycles within recorded history, why assume the model begins there? Each reset leaves fragments that look like legends to the people who inherit them. A collapsed trade network becomes a tale of a world city that fell. A drowned coastline becomes a flood that ended an age. A once common technology, now lost, turns into a relic of a golden time. The next civilization points back to that memory as proof the past was larger, older, cleaner. That habit of backward longing is built into the Greek complaint about living in iron rather than gold. It's built into the Yuga ratios that bake decline into the calendar. It's built into the way genealogies contract after a boundary event. These aren't just stories about morality. They are structured records of reduction. Count enough cycles and a bigger picture takes shape. The Bronze Age moves from a global system to regional pockets, then knits back into something new. The classical Mediterranean splinters, then later centuries pick up threads through translation, trade, and printing. Mesoamerican centres wax and wane with climate bans. Pre-pottery communities ride the edge of sudden coolings and warmings, scattering and regrouping. Each time, some knowledge slips and some survives. Sometimes seeds and star paths make it through. Sometimes metalwork and masonry do. Sometimes all that crosses the gap is a ritual calendar and a way of telling directions by the sky. The next age treats those survivors as anchors and rebuilds around them. So the evidence points away from a straight line. It suggests spirals, some tight, some wide, where growth and stress and failure repeat with different faces. People adapt, improvise, and carry what they can. That fits the old age models better than a flat story of unbroken ascent. The coders of those models weren't naive about progress. They watched cycles in seasons, dynasties, and river floods, and scaled that understanding up to culture. The idea that time itself thins is a metaphor, yes, but it mirrors a measurable shrink in how much a system can hold during certain eras. From there, a different way to read ancient records opens up. When a list shows rains that shorten in a clean curve after a boundary, you can read it as failed biology, or as a description of cycles contracting. When tales across continents place a flood between long ages and short, you can read it as borrowing, or as cultural memory of a real compression event, packaged into durable stories. Once you switch the frame from persons to periods, the impossible figures resolve into a timeline of stability windows, each shorter than the last. This reframing doesn't end debate, it redirects it. Instead of arguing about whether anyone lived 9 centuries, we can ask how far back the contraction sequence goes and what set it in motion. Instead of dismissing long ages as fantasy, we can treat them as signals pointing to the size of prior systems. And instead of treating collapse as failure, we can study it as a phase in a known rhythm, where the key variables are how much memory crosses the gap and how fast complexity returns. That brings the question home: if the old patterns hold, and if ages really do compress after major resets, then the current expansion is only part of a larger swing. The last time networks broke, clay tablets and carved stones carried messages forward. What carries ours? If the next downturn shortens the window, what do we choose to harden, and what do we allow to wash away? The myths don't answer that for us. They only mark the curve and hint at where we stand upon it. So the spiral comes into focus. Not a straight line from caves to code, but a loop that widens and tightens, repeating the same stages with different tools. Civilizations grow, centralize and connect. They hit limits in resources, climate or governance. They strain under complexity. Then they break, pull back and start climbing again with whatever memory survived. The starting point is never zero. It's a salvage yard. Fragments of lore, scraps of engineering, rituals that remember practical knowledge hidden inside story. Agriculture persists even when writing vanishes. Calendars limp along when empires go dark. Each new rise begins on top of old scaffolding that nobody fully understands anymore, but still works well enough to build on. That loop comes with a modern twist. We've stacked our systems so tightly that strength and fragility now grow together. One continent harvests grain, another refines fertilizer, a third manufactures chips, and a global network ties the timing together to the hour. That makes miracles possible. Vaccines at scale, near-instant communication, supply chains that move parts across oceans like blood in arteries. But the same interdependence that unlocks capability also multiplies failure. Lose a few links and the rest buckles. Power grids that depend on stable demand curves, shipping that relies on narrow straits and precise scheduling, data centers that need continuous cooling and clean energy, and financial plumbing that assumes messages arrive in the right order. We gained speed and reach. We also built conditions where a small shock can ripple into a season or a year. Ancient frameworks didn't treat this cycle as a glitch. They treated it as the way things move. In one tradition, the ages turn from a golden state of virtue and longevity toward an iron state of struggle and short horizons, then reset. Another sees the world ending and beginning again, not as a one-time finale, but as maintenance, fire, flood, and a world made new with the survivors who carry rules and names. Across the ocean, world ages stack like layers. Each one ends in a distinct catastrophe, and the next starts on top of its remains. These aren't the same stories, but they share a structure. Time arcs downward, breaks, and arcs again. When you watch actual history close-up, you see the same smaller loops. After a networked age collapses in the Eastern Mediterranean, trade contracts, literacy retreats, and states fragment. Centuries later, seafaring peoples repopulate coasts and rebuild long-distance exchange, but with different scripts and gods. On another continent, cities thin during long drought cycles, monuments go unfinished, and then, after rain returns, new polities rise with abbreviated memory of what came before. Empires to the west shrink in size and ambition. Roads decay, urban sanitation disappears, tax systems fail, public works stop. Knowledge doesn't vanish completely, it migrates. Scholars in different centres keep texts alive, translate, annotate, and extend them. Generations later, those compilations flow back into new institutions and spark renewed inquiry. Meanwhile, in East Asia, repeated patterns of consolidation and breakdown march on a cadence. Unification, prosperity, court excess, provincial revolts, invasion, reconstitution, cycle after cycle, each one rhyming with the last. If you pull back, a slow ratchet becomes visible. Every time the loop turns, a little more remains. Techniques in farming stabilize food during lean years. Writing standards and copying practices improve the chance a text survives fire or neglect. Metallurgy spreads, then returns faster after shock. Seafaring knowledge gets stored not just in practice but in charts and instruments. Today, we've added new layers: redundant satellites, mirrored servers, and archives duplicated in multiple countries. The cycle compresses and re-expands, but it drags more memory from one turn to the next. That's the hopeful piece. Yet it sits next to something less comfortable. Complexity raises the ceiling but lowers the margin for error. In previous eras, a drought could fell a kingdom, but spare the village 2 valleys over. Now, A manufacturing halt in one region can starve assembly lines a hemisphere away. A software failure in a routing protocol can stall payments, flights, or emergency services far from the original bug. Solar storms that once disrupted telegraphs for a few days now have more targets and deeper stakes. Our systems reduce randomness in the short term by predicting demand and smoothing variation, but that encourages the kind of uniformity that, when the model breaks, leaves everyone exposed at once. The old cosmologies read differently in that light. They're not fatalistic, they're diagnostic. They say, expect the turn, expect that institutions saturate, that incentives distort, that leaders cling past their competence. Expect that droughts cluster, storms cluster, and harvests fail in runs, not as independent blips. Expect that people will protect what they can carry in their heads, song, measure, star paths, and that these will bridge the low times better than parchment or code alone. The value is in knowing which shards matter when the load-bearing beams give way. Even the dark intervals aren't blank. They're workshops for consolidation and translation. Legal codes get simplified, liturgy standardizes memory, technologies get repurposed for smaller scales. A water clock becomes a field timer, a cathedral school becomes a hospice. A trading diaspora maintains trust across fractured borders. Tools adapt to the shrunken environment and preserve the minimum skill needed to rebuild when conditions improve. The loop tightens, but a seed bank of methods persists. Our era can learn from that cadence. We already practice versioning and redundancy in engineering, but we rarely apply it to civilizational basics. The fragments that leap across cycles are not just data, but how-tos. How to grow calories with limited inputs, how to make potable water without long supply chains, how to maintain sanitation at village scale, how to generate and store energy off-grid, how to bootstrap communications when networks fragment. They map to real artifacts, printed manuals, open hardware designs, durable materials that can be read without power, and skills taught as craft rather than as services assumed to exist in the background. So the insight lands with both weight and direction. We're not on a ladder, we're on a helix. Each turn carries forward more of what works, provided someone holds it through the bend. That means agriculture never resets to bare foraging once ploughs exist somewhere. It means literacy returns faster when even a few communities maintain schools. It means mathematics and astronomy, once reached, can be resown from a surprisingly small stock of texts and instruments. It also means that digitized knowledge, even at risk from outages and obsolescence, can outlast previous cycles if it's mirrored in forms that degrade slowly and remain legible without specialized tools. The catch is that every added capability brings a new dependency. Batteries rely on specific chemistries. Chips require clean rooms. Plastics depend on feedstocks and refineries. Satellites need ground stations and timing sources. The web needs the grid. The grid needs fuel, transmission corridors, and maintenance crews who can reach sites during storms. At scale, resilience doesn't happen by accident. It needs deliberate design and a clear sense of which components must survive a gap in order to restart the rest. Which brings us to the hinge of our moment. If cycles are normal and memory is the real inheritance, then preparation is not doom thinking, it's stewardship. The question shifts from whether collapse can be avoided forever to whether continuity can be built to survive a sharp contraction. And if the pattern holds, the most valuable work right now is choosing what knowledge and infrastructure can ride out a hard break and light the first lamps on the other side. We've been climbing a staircase of collapses. Here's the odd turn. Some things refuse to fall. Stone holds its edges through wind, rain, and regimes. Ratios sit inside buildings like quiet code. Stories ride human voices longer than ink lasts on paper. Those aren't accidents. Across cultures, people embedded memory in forms designed to survive heat, flood, and forgetfulness. You can walk up to a monument after thousands of years and still read its alignment with the sky. You can stand at a circle of stones and see when winter ends by where the sun rises. You can travel a landscape while reciting a story that doubles as a map. These aren't decorations, they're storage systems engineered to cross time. We treat durability like a side effect of ancient construction when it looks more like the point. Stone can carry simple instructions without translation. Watch how the shadow moves, count the days between markers, return here when the sun sits in this notch. Geometry persists when languages vanish. Ratios outlast kings. Even when no one explains the meaning, the structure keeps pointing in the same direction. That is a kind of redundancy the modern world rarely builds, because we trust electricity more than gravity and networks more than granite. Now hold that against what we use today. Our knowledge sits on spinning platters and flash cells that forget without power. Archives live in buildings that need cooling and constant maintenance. File formats age faster than people, and encryption without keys becomes a locked vault with the combination lost. Pull the plug, and within a few decades, entire libraries collapse into unreadable fragments. A short power crisis turns into a memory crisis. That mismatch should unsettle us. The oldest megaliths still do their job, while last decade's storage already needs migration. You can see why ancient strategies worked. A ring of stones tracks the year because it traps light in an arrangement anyone can verify. It's self-calibrating. The sun validates the device every morning. Oral systems do something similar with the land. A narrative ties landmarks to melody and rhythm, so the next generation carries direction, water sources and danger zones inside a song. No paper required. That's not nostalgia. It's an engineering choice. Put the instructions where people already look and bind them to experiences they repeat. Mechanical knowledge can survive in metal as well as in stone. A device with interlocking gears records cycles you can reconstruct with touch and sight. Even if the toolkit disappears for centuries, a future craftsperson can reverse the ratios and recover the method. The lesson travels through physical relationships, not through brittle software. When contexts vanish, mechanisms that show their work invite rediscovery. This is why the clay artifact in our story behaves the way it does. Those impossible reign lengths demand attention. A scribe copying a mundane list might round a number or soften an absurdity, but not here. The precision forces the reader to ask why. That question becomes the preservation mechanism. You keep the tablet because it won't resolve on first pass. It plants a problem in the archive, not a conclusion. The flood marker acts the same way. A clean break that refuses allegory and insists on boundary. Whoever made that structure wanted it to survive by being too strange to smooth out. That design choice matters because durability often beats complexity. Clay endures where papyrus rots. Stone shrugs off humidity that destroys metal. Oral frameworks survive book burnings and library fires because they copy themselves in living hosts every generation. The simpler the carrier, the longer the half-life. High bandwidth is not the same as high resilience. You can store 1 billion books on servers. You might carry a handful of principles in a carved block that endures 10,000 winters and remains legible to people who never learned your script. You can feel the trade-off in our own systems. We optimize for access and speed, not for survival. The cost of power isn't just electricity, it's continuity. Stop paying the bill, and your cultural memory starts to evaporate. An outage in one region can now cascade into a global blind spot. It doesn't take a world-ending event, only a chain of mundane failures aligned in the wrong week. Meanwhile, a monument's message still works under cloud, ash, and silence. Look across the spectrum of preservation strategies and a pattern emerges. Build instruments that track cycles the sky will verify without instruction. Encode navigation, seasons and hazards in repetitions that bind to memory through rhythm and narrative. Use materials that outlast climate swings and political turnover. Hide sensitive structures under soil when necessary, trusting future uncovering more than present stability. Create puzzles that demand retelling because they never fully resolve. Each move shrinks the dependency surface. Each move bets on primitive redundancy over sophisticated convenience. Revisit the artifact with that lens. The long numbers act like bright flags that tell future readers, do not compress this. The flood boundary provides a checksum. The post-break decline functions like a curve you can plot without a translator. Even if everything else about the culture fades, the shape remains. The structure says more than the words do. That is the hallmark of memory tech designed to jump gaps. This doesn't mean every alignment hides a constant or every carving hides a formula. It means the medium itself carries a philosophy. Reduce assumptions, prefer verification by nature, and make the message impossible to ignore. If you want a lesson to cross millennia, cut it into the environment's own rhythms, or give it a body that aging can't easily erase. The difference between a myth and a manual narrows when a story tells you when to plant, where to move, and what to watch in the sky. So what carries best? Low information density, high resilience packages, ratios instead of raw numbers, alignments instead of prose, repeatable procedures instead of passwords, clay over paper, stone over steel, song over scroll. We tend to think sophistication means more data, tighter tolerances, and nested dependencies. But in the long game, the winners look blunt. They keep working without maintenance. They ask for breath, sunlight, and a horizon line. Nothing more. That leaves us with a strange possibility. Future archaeologists could decode ancient building intent more easily than they could parse our terabytes. They might walk around a durable circle and understand its calendar function in an afternoon, while drives in the rubble sit mute. The oldest tablets may speak more clearly than the newer servers after a few quiet summers. If that sounds bleak, consider the upside hidden in the admission. We can choose our carriers, we can strip down what matters and cast it in media that take a beating. We can design numbers that insist on being remembered because they force a question, not because they hand over an answer. And we can fold the essentials of who we are into forms that don't need us to keep them alive. The museum piece that started this journey shows one way to do it. Our turn is to decide what signal we want to keep sending when the lights flicker. We've been reading the past at a safe distance. Clay tablets, buried temples, ruined roads. Interesting, but remote. Now bring it closer. What if our moment isn't unique at all? What if we're not the first to stack knowledge high and stretch networks across horizons? What if we're the 7th or 8th to do this, walking on the compacted remains of older cycles that rose, cracked and reset, leaving only fragments sturdy enough to survive the grind of time? The sediment under our cities, the myths we normalized and the artifacts that don't fit the standard timeline all hint at that possibility. And if that's even partially true, proximity stops being a metaphor and becomes a location. We live on the uppermost layer of an ongoing stack. Modern life gives the illusion of permanence because it wraps you in systems so large you can't see their edges. The skyline feels like bedrock. Satellites streak every night, business as usual. Cargo routes cross oceans like clockwork. But none of these things stand alone. They hang together through power, timing, logistics, and trust. Remove one link and the others strain. Remove 3 and you learn what cascading failure looks like. Ancient breakdowns tended to be regional. Ours would not be. We live inside a single mesh. Take electricity. Grids knit entire continents into synchronized machines. They balance demand and supply to the second. They lean on long-distance transmission, substations, transformers built to order, and control systems that need clean data to function. A large solar event could knock out high-voltage hardware across wide areas at once. Repair requires factories, spare parts, trained teams, and time. In a best-case scenario, recovery staggers back in fits. In a worse one, it drags beyond human attention spans, and the knowledge that lives only on warm servers starts to die cold. Now add adversaries. Critical infrastructure rides on software layered over hardware layered over contracts. Hospitals, water plants, ports, pipelines, banking systems. Fewer points of presence, more shared dependencies. pull threads with malicious code and real valves stop moving. Rules of conflict change when key functions remote into the same few stacks. Then watch the climate. Regions that fed empires become unreliable. Heat waves come in clusters, droughts bite deeper, floods train over the same watersheds, and planting windows slip. Supply chains don't flex gracefully under synchronized stress. They crack, then reroute, then stop. When trade stalls, specialized components don't arrive, maintenance cycles break, and resilience becomes a memory. Contagion completes the picture. Global movement shortens paths. A disease that once would have burned out in one valley now crosses time zones in hours. Even when mortality stays low, disruption remains high. That stress lands on hospitals, freight, classrooms, and workforce planning at once. The system keeps repeating the same note until parts wear through. So we live with a paradox. We've never held more tools, and we've never been this tightly bound to the continued function of everything else. Here the comparison becomes stark. A clay tablet can sit in dry soil for 4,000 years and still speak to you the moment you bring it into the light. A solid-state drive without power forgets. Magnetic domains drift. Firmware expects a context. File formats age out of readability. Emulators and code libraries disappear. The longer the blackout, the steeper the cliff when you try to climb back to what you thought you owned. This isn't abstract. Whole languages vanished after systemic shocks in the past. Script traditions ended and took techniques with them. Roads decayed and broke trade loops. When they returned, the new versions weren't the same as the old. Knowledge returns unevenly because memory always filters through what survives. Dry clay, stone alignments, oral maps carried by people who refuse to move a boundary stone or tweak a refrain, because doing so would erase the code baked into it. Now place our world on that curve. The phone in your pocket holds the equivalent of a small library, but it doesn't live on your phone. It lives in data centers that live on power and cooling, that live on grids and water and weather. It lives on fiber routes that live on international agreements. It lives on router tables that expect timestamps from satellites. It lives on a long list of ifs. Pull enough of them, and you can't even open the documents you wrote 10 years earlier, assuming you can find them. And yet, we have one clear advantage older cycles didn't. We can name the pattern while we're inside it. Archaeology, geology, and the record of past collapses put a frame around recurrence. We can tell the difference between a local bad year and a structural wobble. We can see how specialization cuts both ways. We can show exactly why the same interdependence that scales our abilities also narrows our margins. That recognition isn't doom, it's leverage. If cycles exist, you can plan for the trough. You can decide what must not break and place it where failure spreads the slowest. You can simplify the core of your memory so it doesn't depend on fragile stacks. You can build redundancy that doesn't look like bloat but like seed. Because continuity doesn't mean keeping everything. It means keeping the right things. Start small and practical. What knowledge compresses well? What practices bootstrap agriculture, water safety, basic medicine, materials and teaching? What standards unlock old data without special tools? What primers teach people how to rebuild grids, not just use them? What maps stay useful when names change? What codes fit on stone and clay without expecting updates? Then zoom out. Institutions can adopt a two-layer model. Modern speed on top, slow memory underneath. The fast layer does cloud, AI, real-time routing. The slow layer prints the keys to restart, in media that don't need permission to be read. Keep a ledger of standards, conversion charts, mathematical tables, open schematics for basic machines, seed catalogues, drug recipes, and repair manuals in stable, human-readable form. Archive across climates. Duplicate in places that don't fail the same way. We don't need to abandon the present to learn from it. We need to take the hint the artifact already gives us. Persistent numbers pull you across resets. The clay outlives the palace. If we are the 7th or the 8th, Our margin lies in accepting that title early and acting like stewards, not final owners. That shifts the question from can we prevent any collapse to how do we aim the next recovery? Because once you accept the cycle, responsibility follows. We owe forward the kinds of records that can be found by hands that don't know our passwords. We owe forward designs that can be built from scrap, not factories. We owe forward a map through the dark that doesn't need electricity to shine, and that points us straight at the next step, deciding what kinds of knowledge can ride out a blackout, and how to store them in forms that don't care whether the grid wakes up tomorrow. What if the document under glass was built as a tool, not a timeline? The Sumerian king list reads like accounting, but its structure behaves like instruction. Those vast pre-flood rains yank the mind out of village-scale memory into spans so large they force humility. The hard line at the flood drills in the rule that destruction can arrive abruptly, and the neat decline after the break works like a lesson about recovery. Each rebuild emerges smaller, more fragile, more temporary. That is not how a legend entertains, it is how a signal trains. Read this way, the numbers act like warning lights. This happened before, it will happen again. Expect contraction. Ancient cultures often treated memory as equipment. They embedded survival into forms people could not ignore. Flood narratives did more than sermonize. They told you to gather seeds, select animals, store food, learn the boat, find high ground, map safe routes. Ethical frames ride alongside logistics because morality keeps the story alive long enough for the practical steps to pass through generations. A society that sees collapse as part of the cycle does not ask whether to prepare. It asks how to remember what to do when the water rises or the fields fail. The king list's shock value durations serve that memory function. They refuse compression into gossip-sized tales. A number like 36,000 will not vanish in casual retellings. It nags and resists, compelling scribes to replicate it with care. A sudden break at the flood engraves an on-off switch into the narrative so future readers feel the cliff. Then, as rains shorten, the pattern models the rough shape of recovery. Long stability erodes into shorter plateaus. This is not random myth inflation. It looks like a framework tuned to teach that continuity thins after catastrophe and must be rebuilt deliberately. Across the world, people use different carriers for the same task. Göbekli Tepe appears buried on purpose, as if its builders wanted the structure to survive more than their politics. That act turns stone into storage. It says protect the map, even if the city falls. Megalithic sites that track solstices and lunar standstills do something similar. They pin the sky to the ground so timekeeping survives when libraries burn. In regions where stone wasn't the medium, knowledge moved along human voices. Aboriginal songlines encode routes, waterholes, seasonal markers, and constraints on movement. The song fits the land fits the song. A melody becomes a topographic file that does not need paper or power. When states fracture, these forms hold. Oral lines can jump across new borders. Stone circles ignore dynastic change. Even buried sanctuaries wait for a future that can read them. The king list sits between these worlds. A clay device robust to fire, copied in schools, framed with numbers chosen for endurance. Its impossible spans do not only measure, they magnetize attention. They make scribal tampering socially dangerous because everyone knows the figure. By being unbelievable, the entries become unforgettable. This folds into a wider habit of encoding through personification. Ancient writers often attached whole conditions of the world to a named figure. A king could embody a dominant pattern. Food abundance, river stability, predictable seasons, safe roads. When the pattern broke, a new king began. The language stayed human, the content stayed structural. If you live inside a cyclical worldview, you teach by arcs and returns, not by timelines with starts and finishes. The list's rhythm, long arc, rupture, shorter arcs, fits that cadence and reads like operational doctrine disguised as lineage. Modern readers tend to strip myth of function and keep only story. But in societies that expect resets, myth is a storage format. It layers moral glue over practical checklists because communities keep moral tales better than they keep manuals. Build the boat rides with "be the kind of person who listens early." Gather seeds travels with care for what regenerates. Prepare for reset pairs with "accept that the world changes faster than you prefer." The king list's flood boundary underlines that timing. When the edge arrives, you are out of time to debate. This approach shows up in how ancient projects tie to the sky. Alignments are calibration keys. They let future users recover the clock even if names, rulers and languages vanish. A corridor that nails a solstice sunrise does not need a glossary. The sun finds it each year and instructs new watchers. Over centuries, those signals rehearse people in recognition. You are here in the cycle. Act accordingly. The king list's post-flood decline functions like an alignment in narrative form. It tells the reader where they stand on the glide path from long stability to brief reprieves. Contrast that with our faith in straight lines. We plan for growth, assume continuity, and treat disaster as anomaly. Yes, we do drills, write risk assessments, stock emergency kits, but we rarely place civilizational mortality in the centre of culture. Our key texts preach progress, not recurrence. That gap leaves us quick to forget and slow to respond. By comparison, a society that frames collapse as ordinary can act without stigma. The lesson sits in sacred space, not in a footnote. The king list's audacity, then, might be less about boasting and more about inoculation. Seen this way, sacred texts and monuments are not backward superstition. They are resilience training encoded to survive amnesia. They wrap coordination problems, how to keep time, how to move together, how to cache knowledge, inside forms that don't depend on high literacy or fragile machines. Clay, stone, stars and memory share the load. Each medium covers for the others when one fails. That redundancy is the point. So the clay prism in the case stops being a report of incredible kings and starts looking like equipment designed to carry forward a rule set. Honor deep time, expect the break, rebuild small and sturdy, protect the clocks, cache the seeds, teach the story so people will care enough to keep copying it, and stress the parts that feel strange, because strangeness keeps the message sticky when everything else thins out. Which brings us back to the gallery lights and the tiny wedges baked into mud. If the list is a manual, not a record, then those impossible numbers are features, not errors. They are engineered to outlast dynasties, trends, and our habit of forgetting. And that means we haven't been staring at a mistake. We've been standing in front of a survival document wearing the mask of history, waiting for a culture that would finally read it the way it was meant to be used. We're back in the museum, in front of the clay prism, and it no longer feels like a mistake. Those enormous rain lengths read like a deliberate signal. They sit there with the patience of baked earth, unblinking, as if the numbers were engineered to outlast the culture that pressed them in. The wedge marks haven't softened their claim, they've sharpened it. You can almost feel the intention, make it impossible to ignore so the message survives the next reset. Now shift the timeline forward. The glass case is dust, the power is gone, and a team sifts through the remains of our world. They map shafts cut into bedrock and lift cores of concrete that still hold rebar patterns. They find alloys that don't rust and ceramics that trap heat signatures from elements best handled through thick gloves. Deep in a mountain, they uncover vaults lined with canisters designed to keep what's inside away from the living for epochs. On the coast, they walk the skeletons of harbours that stretch mile after mile beneath sand. To them, our numbers line the debris like tags on artifacts. They aren't fluent in our languages, but the metrics stand out because math speaks even when alphabets die. They catalogue a concentration of a trace gas in the air captured in bubbles of ancient ice. 420 parts per million. They track orbital debris with ground arrays that still work if you kick them hard enough, counting tens of thousands of objects trapped in predictable paths. They estimate a peak population from foundations, septic fields and layered landfills, more than 8 billion. And when they try to translate our era into their own story sense, it compresses into phrases that carry meaning across time. Before the collapse, they ruled the burning sky for 3 centuries of metal birds. It sounds ridiculous to us. It might be all they need. This is the same reversal the prism forces on us. We read absurd reigns and call them fantasy until we realise the absurdity is the point. It keeps the story anchored. We do a similar thing, but in steel, glass and carbon. Our highways draw vectors across continents that explain our logistics without any captions. Our dams annotate entire valleys with the grammar of stored energy. Our minds dig negative monuments, leaving the missing mountain as a clear statement of intent. If someone else reads our world the way we read Sumer's, they'll decode patterns from form, not footnotes. Cycles don't erase everything. They compress and sieve. Agriculture crossed the Bronze Age break. Scripts slid through Rome's fall with new hands. Astronomy survived nights that lost their libraries. Each time, some knowledge threaded the needle. That carryover is the reason our arguments about firsts and inventions are messy. You can't tell where revival ends and innovation begins when skills reappear in new languages. If this pattern holds, the next cycle will inherit more than seeds and stories. It can inherit caches of instructions, tools sealed against moisture, and systems that explain how to rebuild soil as much as they explain how to orbit a satellite. People are already working on this, whether they talk about cycles or not. They carve archives designed to last longer than institutions. They keep seeds in cold rock so crops don't vanish with power. They copy languages into small, rugged forms that don't need batteries to be read. These projects don't depend on an apocalypse to matter. They're a way of admitting that continuity is a practice, not a promise. So where does that place us in the spiral? Not at the summit and not at the end. We stand in the same stream as the first coastal towns that moved their markers inland and the hilltop villages that kept a flame alive through winters. Our role is less heroic and more practical. Decide what fragments matter enough to harden into things that can be found by hands that won't know our names. Not everything gets to ride the cycle. Complexity sheds weight under stress, and only the most resilient pieces make it through. That's not pessimism. It's how memory works when libraries breathe through human lungs. The prism teaches a final habit. Numbers that force attention become anchors. Long spans, clean ratios, stepwise declines. These are patterns minds recognize even when context dies. Our era has numbers like that, and they don't need decoration. A concentration threshold, a net count in orbit, a total draw of fresh water, a wattage ceiling our grids never safely crossed. If we want a message to pass through outages and outlive file formats, we can borrow the tactic. Encode the essential in a form that resists smoothing. Pair it with materials that don't mind damp, heat and time. Attach it to objects people are likely to keep, because they don't know why they're keeping them. The past shows how to choose forms that last without instruction manuals. Simplicity outperforms elegance under chaos. Stone holds alignment after roofs and scriptures rot. Clay keeps legible marks after palaces fail. Oral maps ride bodies across deserts when ink blurs. Devices that manifest their function without a glossary train the next generation even if the last teacher is gone. The more steps a record needs, the fewer cycles it crosses. Stand again in front of the clay. What felt like a broken spreadsheet now reads like fieldcraft. Make it striking. Make it structured. Make it portable across minds that won't agree about gods or kings. If that's your constraint, impossible reigns are not a flaw, they're a trigger. The tablet refuses to be skimmed. It demands decoding, and because it does, it walked through 4,000 years to reach us with its spine intact. Our artifacts will do the same if we choose well. A stack of non-reactive plates etched with base concepts and base maps, stored in dry stone under public landmarks. doesn't impress anyone today, it will instruct someone tomorrow. A compact seed kit in every regional archive, with hardy cultivars and simple implements, makes more sense than a gigabyte of agronomy hidden in a password-locked cloud. A star map with epoch markers placed where they can be seen without math extends the chain of nights that taught people when to sow and when to move. This isn't about surrendering complexity, it's about giving complexity a way to restart with fewer wrong turns. The king list held on because its keepers knew what they were doing. They cut the world at a flood, and they made the cut so sharp that we still feel it. Our turn now is quieter. What numbers do we elevate so they can do their job after the grid goes silent? What forms do we choose so the message can be read by light from the sun and not a screen? The clay waits, and the spiral keeps turning, and somewhere in that turn, a hand will reach for what we left behind and call it the beginning.